Good. Okay. Well, welcome everybody. I'm Peter Murray. I'm chairman of the London Society, and it's my pleasure this evening to introduce Ike Ijeh. He's the architecture critic for Building Magazine, as well as for Building Design Online. He's a founder of London Architecture Walks and London Architecture Works. And his new book, Designing London, Understanding the Character of the City, is published by Lund Humphries. And this is, of course, very much on message because characterization of London is one of the key parts of the New London Plan, which has been hopefully or will be delivered by Sadiq Khan over the next few months, if he can gain agreement with Robert Jenrick in the Ministry of Housing, Community and Local Government. But anyway, let me now hand you over to Ike.
Thank you very much, Peter, and welcome everybody. Thank you for attending. As Peter said, my name is Ike Ijeh. I'm an architect and a critic. I've written this book on London, design in London, understanding the character of the city. And this evening, I'm going to give you a very quick, compact fly-through through what the book's about, my approach to it, why I wrote it, and some of the conclusions that it draws. Now, you'll have to bear with me and be gentle with me. It's the first time I've used this Zoom application in this manner, so be gentle. Right, without further ado, I'll try and head towards my first slide. Where are we? Right, if I get to the first page. I apologize, give me. Right. Hopefully everyone can see that. Hopefully everyone can see that. Right, so the first slide, this is similar to the cover of the book. It isn't quite. Designing London, Understanding the Character of the City. Now the book is structured in 3 parts, and I'm going to conduct tonight's talk in 3 parts as well. Now the first part of the talk will focus on understanding London's character, trying to define what that character is, and also trying to explain why I feel elements of it might be under threat. The second part will be about protecting London's character, and that is going to be executed by identifying some of the core social and physical ingredients which comprise that London's character. I think I identify about 30 in the book. I'm not going to bore you with all of them this evening. I'll probably focus on 2 or 3. And the final part will be about how we can enhance London's character. And the way I did that in the book, and when I'm going to do that this evening, is by selecting a series of case studies showing recent examples of key schemes within London, which I feel have either enhanced London's character or harmed it. And by doing that, I think we get a kind of understanding of, hopefully, certainly in my opinion, what works and what doesn't. And that can then lead us to make decisions, design decisions, interventions that enhance the character of the city. In the book, I chose 16 case studies in total, 8 harm and 8 enhance. Again, I won't bore you with all of them, but I think I'll give you 2 from each sector from each category this evening. Okay, this first page, it's not quite the front cover of the book, but it's similar. The real focus of the book, yes, it's a book that deals with architecture and urbanism, but first and foremost, I wanted it to be grounded in people. I wanted it to have a very kind of humanistic approach, and I wanted that because that reflects London as a city. London's a huge city. It's one of the biggest capital in Europe, one of the big cities in the world. But part of its fame and charm and success has been its ability to kind of extrapolate that scale, or kind of dissect that scale into a very humanistic and individual kind of bite-sized module. So this human aspect, which sometimes I feel gets forgotten by architecture, I'm happy to say that as an architect myself, is something I really wanted to focus on in the book, which explains the people in front of St. Paul's Cathedral there. Right, I'll try and navigate towards the second page. Let's see how that works. There we go. Right. Now, why did I write this book? I suppose it's twofold. One part of it, key part of it, was an exploration of the character of the city I love, but also it was to kind of rally and call to arms about areas where I feel that character may be under threat. Now, one of the reasons why I started this book was because of a little anecdote that happened to me a few years ago. I also run a kind of an architecture walks company, and occasionally we do architecture boat tours along the Thames. And a few years ago, I was given one of these tours, passing this stretch of the river, and there was a lovely Hungarian man from Budapest, and he pointed to the north side of the river, and he said, "What's that little castle over there?" And he meant the Tower of London, but he referred to it as a little castle, as he explained to me later on, because it was swamped, or at least its background was submerged by all the towers and high-rises of the City of London. So that's when it kind of struck me. Obviously, yes, London develops, change is important to London. London's not just an old city, it's a modern city as well, but it has to be a balance. And possibly the City of London and tall buildings are one area where that balance has, possibly we haven't got it as right as it should be, and that's potentially threatening the character of the city. This particular image is slightly disingenuous because it doesn't exist yet. Not all these buildings are here. So you can see the lovely walkie-talkie to the left-hand side. The buildings that, you can also see 22 Bishopsgate. There's not many times where 22 Bishopsgate fades into the background, but it does here. You see behind the Leadenhall Tower. One undershaft, which hasn't even started yet, or as I like to refer to it, the stack of CDs, is the tallest building you can see here. And to the right, you can see the suppository, or the tulip, which is also currently appealing, I understand, to the GLA's refusal of it. So obviously this is a planned future for the City of London, but is this a future for the city we want? Do we want the heritage of the city, buildings like the Tower of London, almost seen as kind of toy anecdotes, this kind of high-rise future behind it? So this kind of image, this potential future, obviously prompted partially by this chap's question on this tour, is partially what prompted me to write the book. Now, the book isn't just dealing with tall buildings and assessing whether they're good or bad for London's character. By no means, it's not just that. It talks about many, many other issues as well, which have been either used to enhance or maybe more recently undermine London's character, such as design quality, when that's perhaps been lacking, London's planning system, which performs well in some areas but not well in other areas, which I'll develop on later on, the housing crisis we suddenly find ourselves in, and this failure to kind of reconcile heritage and contemporary modernity, and also a failure to reconcile context with a lot of new developments as well. So all these things combined together to kind of form the, I don't think we're in at the moment, but certainly a point whereby London can make decisions which I feel are either for its betterment or for its detriment. So essentially, I'll just read a little bit from the book here. So my point is that these series of chronic negations are slowly but surely chipping away at the unique and precious character that's essential to London's identity as a city, and that renders the capital such an attractive location for development to take place in the first place. In other words, the golden eggs are potentially poisoning the goose. Increasingly in London, we see the same incongruous, identikit brand of globalized architectural anonymity that dilutes the character and individuality that makes cities everywhere, especially chaotic, kaleidoscopic London, unique. Carrying on slightly, the irony is that in today's planning and architecture environment, urban character is supposedly all the rage. It is frequently cited by planners, developers, and architects as something that they wish to protect and enhance. And its ubiquitous placemaking doppelganger now dominates professional planning and architectural parlance. But little or no effort is ever made to define urban character in specific or quantitative terms. On one level, this is understandable. Urban character is not a distinct or scientific entity. It cannot be described in definitive historic or decorative terms, like an architectural style, nor does it have measurable technical or structural attributes like a building or a bridge. Part of the quality and charm of urban character is its very amorphous and even atmospheric nature. The feeling of a place is always harder to describe than its look, but that feeling is an absolutely integral part of how we judge and experience cities. Yet how that feeling is constructed is rarely understood. The problem with something that is difficult to understand is that it is easy to ignore. And that is exactly the crisis London currently finds itself in today. So that gives a bit of a background to why I wrote the book. As I said, my argument is not to use character or context as a straitjacket to harness development, by no means. But my argument is by forging a deeper understanding of character and context, we're all better equipped to make design interventions that enrich the city rather than imperil it. Right, so that's a kind of opening introduction, if you like, making my pitch. How do we define that character? What are the characteristics of London's character, if that's not too wordy a term? What essentially, from a kind of urban architectural point of view, makes London tick? What gives it its identity? Right, this book, my book, identifies a number of these kind of key constituents of London's urban character. I think it identifies about a dozen. They range from all kinds of things to kind of London's village composition, to the tradition of unplanned development we have in London. London's unique in not really having one time in its history where one single unified vision has been imposed on the city, apart from Nash and Prince Regent's work with the Via Triumphalis at the beginning of the 19th century. There's an emphasis on humanism and domesticity in London. Architecture makes a big impact in London, even in central London, civic central London. This kind of domestic residential feel is a big part of its character as well. So these are lots of different kind of characteristics identified as being part of that character, but I'll discuss just 3 of those in a bit more detail here. Right, the first is this tradition of informality and irregularity you have in London. If you just look at an A to Z, or I'll show my age, Google Street Maps, and you will see the plan of London, it's haphazard, it's organic, it's irregular. It doesn't have the kind of orthogonal rectilinear grids of Manhattan or Barcelona. So it's always had this organic kind of haphazard layout, and that is reflecting this kind of very informal and irregular characteristics within its urban character as well. It's probably one of the least formal and least homogeneous big cities in Europe, and it tends to reject uniformity in a way that other large European cities do not. Right, I'll just read another little excerpt from my book, which will help explain that. Some of the facets or ways in which this kind of tradition of irregularity are portrayed are varied street frontages, asymmetrical squares, kinked thoroughfares, diverse materials, high stylistic variety, and even more recently, London's chaotic skyline. So all these, in a way, kind of fit into this tradition of haphazard, organic, irregular development that we see in London. I like my anecdote, so I'm going to come to another anecdote here. Here we can see an aerial view of Horse Guards Parade in the centre of London, near Buckingham Palace. I was doing one of my walks, this time not on a boat, taking a group of German tourists through Horse Guards Parade, and I was describing the buildings all around it. And I noticed one tourist, I think he was actually an architect, he was increasingly getting irate throughout my little speech. And he just cut me short, and he just said at one point, "But where is the master plan?" Now, what he meant was, I was describing the grandeur of these buildings, this big open square. Horse Guards Parade is the largest open space in central London. If you look closely at it, even though it seems to, at one level, conform to the kind of European civic, big kind of public square rules, it doesn't entirely. If you look at the middle here, you can see William Kent's Horse Guards building, which is obviously symmetrical. It's centered on this axis that runs through the parade to the Guard Memorial on the other side of St. James's Park. But if you look on either side of that, symmetry completely breaks away. On the left-hand side, you've got the Renaissance Edwardian Admiralty buildings with the green top domes on the left-hand side. And on the right, you see William Kent's old Treasury building. And further there, you just see the gardens, and you can just make out the brick building to the right, the back of number 10 Downing Street. So basically, this is typical of a London square, of a London space. It's kind of playing at symmetry to one degree, but when you look closer and kind of peel away the surface, it isn't symmetrical. It's a bit haphazard. It's kind of deliberately organized chaos, if you like, and kind of going away from these traditionally accepted ideas of what kind of urbanism should be. So the answer is, often in London, to answer my tourist, there is no master plan, but that is part of London's charm and appeal, this kind of ingrained chaotic charm or kind of mild chaos that you seem to have, that you often have in the city. And Horse Guards Parade is very much an example of that. As well as that, you can also make out one of the most common, as I mentioned before, the irregular street pattern. If you look at the kind of slight curve of Whitehall, Horse Guards Road on the other side, there's clearly no grid here, and that's another manifestation of the tradition of irregularity that we have in the city. Another element is this tradition of diversity and contrast that we have in London. I mentioned before that London is a very diverse city in terms of its materiality, its building styles, building types, typologies. This kind of tradition of diversity and contrast is something that's a really key part of kind of London's character. And if anyone's been to Greenwich Park and looked down towards towards Queen's House in the old Royal Naval College, the old Greenwich Palace, and then you see the kind of forest of skyscrapers of Canary Wharf and East London behind them, that very much kind of encapsulates this kind of principle of contrast that you have within the city. Now that's good in one way. That shows London's far more dynamic than other historic European cities. You rarely get that kind of very kind of hard juxtaposition of different types of buildings in other historic European cities. That's a good aspect, good element of London's character. And if you give me a second, but the problem sometimes can be that when that contrast is uncontrolled, then you get an opening for irresponsible urban development to take place. Such as, for instance, this image here is a new tower. I think it's 50 Fenchurch Street that's been proposed in the City of London. They actually got permission during the lockdown. It was one of the city's virtual planning meetings. And you can see as part of the tower's development, they've retained a 12th century tower to, I think it's St. Catherine's Church within the City of London. That's been retained here. But to me, this is almost contrast that's gone too far. It's contrast for the sake of it. There has to be a grounding and an anchoring in rules or values that mean that you don't just get contrast by putting two things together and hoping for the best. I remember listening to a speech from Peter Rees, the former city head of planning, a few years ago, and he was all for contrast. Any question that he would get from concerned heritage conservationists about the juxtaposition between old and new, he would say, it's all contrast, it's fine. Contrast can be fine, but chaos isn't. And when you don't have any kind of prescribed or controlled understanding, I think, of the city's grain and character and context, you get elements like this. Now, to me, I mean, you could look at this church and kind of an anodyne glass skyscraper behind it as, you know, compelling. But to me, it also suggests a kind of anodyne dystopian theme park where heritage is sporadically retained with the kind of grotesque condescension that we used to see with the severed heads of criminals being raised on spikes in London, on London Bridge. It's kind of a conceited way of retaining history as an adjunct to kind of anodyne glass offices, which could almost be built anywhere. So yes, contrast is a part of London's character and development and heritage, but it also does leave open the door for abuses and irresponsibilities I feel are increasingly prevalent, particularly within the City of London, and are represented by this kind of image here. Right, so those are the elements of London's character. And now I'm going to give you just a couple of examples of why I feel that character is under threat. One I mentioned briefly before is tall buildings. This is Lombard Street looking east in the City of London, and you can see the ever lovely walkie-talkie kind of striding at the back of the street like some dystopian Mordor nightmarish vision of the future. Now again, it comes back to the contrast debate. You could look at this and say, oh, it's wonderful that you have this kind of mixture between old and new. But to me, I mean, much has been criticized about the walkie-talkie, but this image typifies what's wrong with it and what is wrong and what is lacking in the city's policy with regard to tall buildings at the moment. It's oppressive scale, it's completely blocking out light towards the street, it's completely out of scale with the street as well, and it's blocking the sky. You used to see sky beyond here. Obviously, I know tall buildings, I love tall buildings, I'm not against them, they will block the sky by their nature, but I think the balance here has not been sought as cleverly as it could be. Now, these kind of examples sadly have been on the rise, I believe, in London. There's been a huge increase in skyscrapers proposed or built in London in recent years. Peter Murray's own NLA has done excellent work in quantifying those. I'll just give you a quick excerpt here. As of March 2019, a record-breaking 541 buildings of 20 stories or more were proposed across the city, a 6% increase on the previous year. To encapsulate the surge, in the 33 years between 1968 and 2001, 10 buildings, just 10 buildings taller than 150 meters were completed in London, just 10. In 2019 alone, the number was 25. So obviously there's been an exponential increase in the amount of tall buildings within London. Now that doesn't have to be a problem. I love tall buildings. Later on, I'm going to talk about the Shard, and I feel that's one example of a modern building that enhances the city of London. But my argument is, and what's lacking in London, which is what I go into in this book, is that London lacks a definitive, strategic, London-wide policy framework to regulate the development of tall buildings in the city. And when I say the city, I don't just mean the city of London, I mean the whole city, and to say where they may or may not be appropriate. Loads of other cities, most other cities have this. New York, Düsseldorf, Washington, Paris. I don't see why we can't have the same kind of thing in London, not to ban tall buildings, but simply to plan them and to make sure that they don't cause the kind of harm that we've seen with the walkie-talkie. The GLA, who's the only kind of London-wide planning authority, they're the ones we should look to, I suppose, for this kind of leadership. But all they've done in the past is just engage in vague platitudes, such as tall buildings should relate well to local context and character. Tall buildings should ensure that they do not have a scale, mass, and bulk that does not threaten local character. But there's been no effort to quantify what relate well or threaten means. So it's vague, it's not strict enough to be the kind of clear policy criteria which can control the development of tall buildings and ensure that mistakes like the walkie-talkie do not happen again. Right, so tall buildings is one example where London's character is under threat. Another one, and this is a minefield, particularly for architects listening to me, is design. Design is subjective. I know that as a critic as well as an architect. I always enjoy the anecdote from 2006 when Private Eye magazine awarded Will Alsop's Palestra building in Southwark the worst London building award in 2006. And months later, it promptly won a RIBA London Award the following year. So design is subjective, and one man's wonderful piece of architecture or woman's might not necessarily be shared by anybody else. And I don't want to fall into the trap of being, what's the term Paul Finch uses, a miserabilist and grumbling about all this development happening in London. There's a huge amount of good design in London, much of it identified by Peter Murray and the NLA. London in recent years, even in residential housing, has been really seen as a kind of beacon for good housing design across the country. But there is still an awful lot of dross. There's too much. Traveling through London today, I'm going to read briefly again from the book, one can see a number of identical design solutions, particularly on residential developments, that either actively or unwittingly suppress the rich diversity and quirky individualism that was once a key part of the city's character. One sees the same unitized cladding solutions repeated over and over again, the same sub-London vernacular brick paneling, the same crudely recessed upper stories to suggest the building is shorter than it actually is, the same extraneous canopies to dumbly denote an entrance, the same bloated floor plates, the same squat rectilinear blocks, the same sterile glass skyscrapers. For a city whose character has been historically defined itself by the abject rejection of uniformity and monotony in favor of individuality and variety, it is depressing indeed to see so much London architecture lie prostrate before the authoritarian altar of anonymity. And I've just picked one of potentially several examples here. This is Woolwich Central, a scheme, I think it was completed in 2014. Again, design is subjective. You may fall in love with this image, but for me and for others, it does kind of denote a kind of collapse of design skill that could be applied to many other schemes and is maybe indicative of this kind of threat to London's character that I'm certainly postulating is around. Right. I'll just quickly zoom through these. An easy kind of comparing cities and understanding character. An easy way of understanding character sometimes by making comparisons. And by these comparisons, we bring out kind of key characteristics that identify London. So what I did in this section of the book, in this section of the presentation, is just take 4 cities, Berlin, New York, Paris, and Rome, and take key buildings from them and compare them to the buildings in London. So on the top left, we have Carl Schinkel's Alters Museum in Berlin from the 1820s. Contemporaneous is the British Museum, just to the right by the Smirk brothers, also 1820s, both Grecian kind of monumental palaces, temples. If you look at the Alters Museum, big open square outside it, but look at the British Museum. It's kind of hemmed in on a side street. Now, this is typical of what London does. It doesn't really give individual civic architectural set pieces the space they may get in other cities. It makes them bend to the will of the irregular street plan rather than the other way around. Below, we have the Lincoln Center in New York and the Barbican Center in London. Again, contemporaneous, built in the, well, conceived certainly in the 1950s, 1960s. Look at the Lincoln Center, its main central square, thrusting open to Broadway, open, transparent, very public and civic. Now, I used to live in the Barbican. This is the bottom of Lauderdale South, for those of you who know it. There's many good things about the Barbican. It represents a kind of exceptional, heroic period of British architecture and egalitarian social development as well. But I mean, this perimeter is unacceptable. It's kind of sterile and punitive, whereas it could use this wonderful cultural amenities to potentially animate its edge. It severs itself from the rest of London by having this wall, not continuously, but for a great deal of time around the development, which really severs it from the city. So in many ways, it's anomalous to London, but it does reveal elements which we should be wary of. On the top here, we have the Paris Opera House and the Royal Opera House. The Paris Opera House, kind of bejeweled spectacle of a great urban set piece. The Royal Opera House kind of squeezed onto a side street. Now, initially, you may think that the Royal Opera House is more modest, which it is, but it does reveal things that you don't necessarily see in other cities, such as, you kind of see it here, but there's a floral hall built next door, which is essentially a flower market. So essentially, that kind of reveals London's social porosity. You've got the egalitarian toil, if you like, proletariat toil of the floral hall, and then the kind of elite, if you like, of the opera house right next to each other. Also, because London doesn't allow buildings like the Royal Opera House to kind of spread out in the way that you do in Paris, you have subtle kind of increments of engagement over time, whereby buildings have to kind of subtly engage with the surrounding fabric, such as the Dixon Jones extension to the Royal Opera House in the 1990s. So that's indicative of the way London deals with set pieces too. And on the bottom, you have a comparison between St. Peter's in Rome and St. Paul's in London. St. Peter's thrusts itself, almost like an architectural full frontal, if you like, very much kind of formal axial centerpiece of the street plan in Rome and kind of Rome's urban form. But St. Paul's is very different. It almost creeps into view. It's much more reticent, kind of, if you're walking down from Fleet Street, the dome of, not the dome, the spire, sorry, of St. Martin within Ludgate, the church on the left, almost dances around the dome as it kind of plays this kind of peekaboo game of surprise, concealment, and revelation. And that kind of much more incremental, immersive pedestrian experience is, again, very typical of London's character as well. Right, I'm rabbiting on, so I'll speed through the final bits. Believe it or not, that was just part 1, so part 2 and 3 will be much shorter. So the next slide shows housing. Now, part 2, as I said, was about understanding, part 2 was about protecting character. So in that part, I identified about 30 different aspects of ingredients, social and architectural ingredients and physical ingredients of London's character, such as materials, paving, planning, housing, style, views, river, etc., and use them to kind of almost provide an analytical manual of what the physical and social constituents of London's character. Now, this relates to housing. This is a scheme. Here we go. This is a scheme by AHMM Architects. It's Signal Townhouses in it's in Greenwich, completed 2016, and it's kind of a contemporary reworking of the back-to-back terrace house typology. But this is very much indicative of the kind of contemporary reinterpretation of housing that we're having now in London, which is also a key part, one of these key ingredients of its character. Now, housing plays a big role in kind of London's soul and identity and expression. I'll just briefly read from the book here again. Acknowledge London as one of the most humanist of big cities, then its approach to how it houses its population is central to both this claim and the city's character. London houses millions of people, but unlike Paris or New York, the majority of them live in houses rather than flats. Almost 9 million people live in London, and they live in just over 3.5 million residential dwellings. Of these dwellings, 58% are houses, with the remainder being flats. This compares to New York, where of its 3.4 million dwellings, less than 9.5% are houses, with the remainder, a vast majority of over 3 million, being flats. Of the 58% of London dwellings that are houses, terraced housing forms by far the largest contingent, 47%. Semi-detached and detached houses account for 39% and 14% respectively. This housing mix has a profound impact on London's character for two reasons. First, houses tend to project more individuality than flats. They present the infinity of the urban condition reduced to a more scalable bite-sized chunk. This intimacy of domesticity combined with the emphasis on the individual rather than the collective, at least in residential terms, has an extraordinarily civilizing effect on mass urbanism and is absolutely core component of London's character and appeal. And secondly, the statistics also make clear that the terraced house is a definitive London housing type. So essentially, just explaining there, terraced houses make up a big feature of London's character. There's also obviously many other types, Georgian townhouses, the Edwardian Victorian terraces with their bay windows, such as I grew up in, mansion blocks, almshouses, council estates, tower blocks. All these together form very much part of a patchwork of housing that again forms a big part of London's character. Trees and nature. Nature too, very big part of the city's character. London's very much seen as a kind of, well, it has a huge amount of trees, it has a huge amount of parkland. Again, I'll read very briefly, and I'm pressed for time here. Give me a second. Where are we? Right, London is one of the greenest capital cities in the world. 1/3 of its land is allocated to public green space, and 47% to green space of all kinds, the highest proportion for a city its size in the world. In New York, the figure for public green open space is 27%, while in Paris it is just 9%. In London, there is also 27 square meters of green space for every inhabitant, while in Istanbul, it is 6.4 square meters, in Tokyo, 3 square meters, and in Buenos Aires, just 1.9 square meters. So this kind of natural aspect is a big part of London's character, and it's also a big part of how London, despite its scale, manages to humanize itself and make it more intimate and kind of soften the potentially hard-edged character or reputation it may otherwise have. Now, this obviously is an extreme example. This is St. James's Park with Buckingham Palace in the background there, and it's almost unthinkable. It would almost be unthinkable to have this kind of great iconic projection of civic or royal power in any other European city, not surrounded by cafe shops, boulevards, a metro station. But in London, we don't have any of that around it. It's literally submerged in the middle of a gigantic, luscious, rolling countryside park. So as I said, it's an extreme example, but it does show this very kind of close and intuitive relationship that London has with nature. And finally, for this section, there's also an element that looks at London public spaces and the role they play in terms of its character. Now here, I'll just quickly zoom in on some of these elements. This is a matrix. I picked around 60 public spaces in mainly central London, including Bloomsbury Square here, Golden Square, Trafalgar Square, Manchester Square, and kind of tried to break them down and analyze each one and give them scores, if you like, to certain features. Such as, if we look, sorry, I'm scrolling here, you can see the top level, top elements refer to the categories: civic, residential, adapted from residential, such as Leicester Square, which is built as residential, adapted, commercial retail, hard landscape centre, regular, formal composition, fully pedestrianised, etc. And the results are quite revealing. See, it's not definitive, as it were, but you see here 30% of certain squares I mentioned are civic, and yet 51% of them, a majority, are residential, again revealing this kind of residential emphasis in London's character. And if we zoom over to irregular or formal composition, you will note that, where 62% of the squares are an irregular formal composition, and just 38% are a formal composition. So this is scientific. It's not necessarily a definitive example of trying to analyze these squares, but from this kind of data, we get a better understanding of how London treats public space, and again, what role that plays in its character. Right, final section. I'll zoom through this in just 5 minutes, and then I'll conclude. The final part of the book, if I can, here we go. Give me a second. Final part of the book, as I said, is about enhancing London's character. And what it does is identify a number of case studies whereby I think London's character has either been harmed or enhanced. It's always good to end on a high. I start with the examples where I believe that character has been harmed. And I identify 8 buildings which I think have harmed it and 8 which I think have improved it. I'll just give you 2 of each, very briefly. One which I think has done considerable harm, probably more damage than any other building in the city, including the walkie-talkie as well, is 22 Bishopsgate, which is still under completion, not quite finished yet. Tallest building in the City of London, a colossal scale, which is out of scale with everything around it, even other skyscrapers. I mean, to get a sense of the size of this building, it's 80 meters wide. That's 3 times as wide as the M25. Under what planet does a building of that scale, did anyone think it would be a good idea to fit that into a historic part of London, which is famed for its fine grain and intricate narrow plots? It's completely contextually inappropriate. It's overbearing. The building in itself, it doesn't taper as tall buildings supposed to. You can see the cheese grater on the right-hand side here. It makes it almost impossible to take the city seriously, I feel, as a kind of take the city seriously as a historic centre. And it's inflicted huge damage. And why we are importing this kind of, as I said, I love tall buildings, but why we're importing a style or an image or identity of architecture that could apply to almost any other city in the world, and using it to denigrate the unique charm and characteristics of our oldest district is beyond me. And to me, it severs those intricate patterns and characteristics and aspects of the City of London and diminishes everything around it to the kind of state of almost a Lilliputian toy. Right, where are we? Oh, sorry. Nova Victoria, another lovely building. This is, oh, I hope you'll load, in central London. Probably the worst office block, I think, has been built in central London, certainly outside the City of London in recent times. Victoria's had a history of being aggressively developed since the Second World War, but this building, you've got to remember as well, Victoria's surrounded by historic terraces and stuccoed houses of Pimlico, Belgravia, etc. And you have this building, again, out of scale and context, and just in terms of its form, it's got awkward jutting angles. It's got these kind of swirling fins, which make the whole building look as if in a state of disintegration, jagged glass shards, and it's got these ludicrous red prows that make it look like the inflamed, inhaled chest of some demented cockerel. So essentially, this isn't the way I feel we should be treated London. It's gimmick architecture of the worst kind, and it's a good example, sadly, of London's character being damaged. Right, we're going to end on a high. Controversial, I know. Not everyone likes the Shard. The Shard is a lovely building. It also proves I'm nothing against tall buildings as long as they're well designed and cited. Renzo Piano, part of his development of concept for the Shard, he looked at it. He looked at old pictures of Canaletto, old paintings Canaletto did in London in the 1750s, saw that London essentially was spires surrounded by this mothership of St. Paul's, and essentially created a gigantic spire out of glass and steel. So even though it's clearly a contemporary building, it's kind of engaging with that heritage of the city, which is a way in which it kind of integrates itself into the city. Just finally, another key aspect I like about the Shard is a top. The top came in for some criticism because it almost looks incomplete. But to me, it shows a kind of haunting frailty, with kind of a very kind of humble approach, where by the fact it looks incomplete, it's almost as if the city's kind of flowing through it, as you often see in the top of many Wren steeples. So it's a very modern way, I think, of appealing to the heritage of city. And the final slide, if you'll find it. There's another scheme which I think is good. This Beccleston yards, again in Victoria. Now this is unusual. It used to be a service yard, so it's kind of backland hinterlands of London. It used to be a car park. There used to be an electricity substation there. That's all been cleared away, and this new public space has been created, and also new kind of social and leisure amenities in the buildings all around it. This is interesting because it retains that kind of backlands, otherworldly kind of concealed feature of the original development, but what it does, it just makes it usable. It also puts in new pedestrian routes through it. So what's good about this, I think, because it really kind of emphasizes that messy, quirky, individualistic, irregular, colorful, and whimsically odd otherworldliness of London's parallel backstreet world. And these are the kind of elements, yes, they're hard to understand, but these are kind of nooks and crannies that make up London. And it's not appropriate always, but it's good and encouraging for me, at least, to see a new development take that in its stride and try and emphasize it. And here we go. That's just a picture of the book. That's the final slide. So thank you very much. Sorry for overrunning, I think, Peter, but over to you.
Good. Well, thank you very much, Ike, for that's a really great talk about issues which I think are right at the heart of our debate, which we have in the London Society, obviously very often about the quality of architecture and how we deliver change in London. And I thought I'd just read a quote, because it seems to be one of the issues is that London is a very different city to many other European cities, particularly in, I understand, the remonstrations of the chap you were guiding around. I can't remember, where was he from? Budapest or somewhere, that who couldn't understand that you know, what we call planning is actually planning, because they do things very differently there.
Yes, they do.
And I've just actually been reading a book which I called the Anarchy, which is about the East India Company, which is I would recommend it to everybody. Fascinating book. It really it rewrites one's idea about history, I think, particularly of our relationship with India. But one of the really interesting quotes I found was about Calcutta. And I'll just read it for you. But this is a quote from the Comte de Modave. And we were, when we were in India, we were fighting in the late 18th century with the French a lot. So anyway, so the Count said, "It is not without astonishment and some irritation that a stranger looks at the city of Calcutta. It would have been so easy to turn it into one of the most beautiful cities in the world by just following a regular planned layout. One cannot fathom why the English failed to take advantage of such a fine location, allowing everyone the freedom to build in the most bizarre taste with the most outlandish planning. An effect, it is said, of British liberty, as if such liberty were incompatible with good order and symmetry." And I think that it's a brilliant quote, I think, because it does pick up on that whole aspect of London's attitude to planning, argumentative planning, rather than, you know, the French. They're used to the Napoleonic Code to decide exactly what happens, and they're totally inflexible. And I think one of the great successes of London is its ability to change, to be more flexible, and to, in many ways, it's a merchant city, and it responds to commercial pressures in a way that cities like Paris don't. But that has been a part of its success. So my comment is, or my question, and I would just remind everyone that they can put questions on the Q&A panel, and we've got some good ones coming in already, so do put your questions there. But my comment is, how does one draw the line in accepting what you say absolutely rightly is London's informality and lack of, I'd say, rigor of plans, and then controlling it and saying, oh, we can't have this tower there, we can't have this tower here. Who decides on that balance, and how do you get that balance right? And I think a lot of your criticism is absolutely correct, but I'm not sure you've given us an idea of how one actually creates a system which provides a very difficult solution of controlling that.
I think it's a great question, and I completely take your point. And all those things you mentioned are things I love, and many people love about London. It's kind of craziness. It's kind of it's almost lack of planning, which is a key part of the city's character. Now, you mentioned the word there, balance. For me, it's all about balance, not about exiling any particular style of architecture or exiling tall buildings or exiling castles. It's about finding a way for all of those to coexist. And I'm going to give a very boring answer. I think the person or the people or the system best placed to do that is the planning system. And that's a system that used to do it. If you look at the forerunners of the GLA, not necessarily the GLC, but the London County Council was incredible. It was exemplary at still making London a dynamic city, but also making sure that the things that made London London received a reasonable amount of protection. Before that, the Metropolitan Board of Works as well, the slum clearances in Victorian London, 19th century, some of those which were brutal, far more brutal than anything we do today, but it was still done with a mind of the bigger picture of what London is and a vision for the overall city. So it's easy to just say planning, but we have to get the planning system working better. I don't think it's working as well as it should be. And I think we can't just leave it to architects. We can't just leave it to developers because we don't have the bigger picture. The only people that do have the bigger picture is the planning system. They're the ones in control. They say what goes ahead and what doesn't. So we have to make that system as good as possible so it can accommodate those two extremes which we just talked about, in my opinion.
Great, thank you very much. Well, let's go to our Q&A panel, and we've got a number of questions up there. Do add further ones if you've got something you'd like to ask. But first one is Joe East, who says, do you think that the changes that are suggested by COVID, that a moratorium on all the developments that should be put in to ensure that we do not build empty ivory towers? So will we be not requiring all those towers maybe when everyone's working from home as we are today?
I think there's a possibility that may be the case. I don't ever think there'll be a time where the City of London will stand empty or Central London won't need offices. There will definitely be a use for them. And the scheme I mentioned, 50 Fenchurch Street, which I was critical of earlier on, the city planning authorities passed that during the lockdown, and they specifically said that despite the lockdown, they still perceive an upturn in office demand when all this is over. So I don't think office demand is going to go away, but I think this does give us space to kind of think what kind of city we want and what kind of impact we want to make these large totemic buildings, whether they be office or residential, what impact we want them to have on the city. So maybe moratorium is too extreme a word, but definitely I think this potentially does give us space to review where we have been going and potentially change it. But I don't think we'll ever get to a time where we won't have offices or even, in some degree, unfortunately, tall glass skyscrapers still being demanded, if not built, in the City of London.
Thanks. Now, another one we've got, hi, I'm a councillor, that's Alessandra Rossetti. We see examples of crazy development everywhere. A local authority planning department can only deny approvals for material considerations. And one of the major issues and problems is that only the applicant can appeal against the decision. Residents, even if impacted directly by the development, can't. So I'm sure you're familiar with that problem, but do you think in terms of getting that balance, do we need more, let's say, community access to decision making and greater involvement of communities in deciding what happens?
Yeah, I think we do, frankly. Now, it's difficult. The planning system is already pretty potentially tortuous. It's not easy to get a building built in this country. And I wouldn't want to necessarily make that process any harder. But on the other hand, the way we have things at the moment, you get schemes where communities and locals do feel ostracized. And I know we have public consultation, but I'm an architect. I've been involved in public consultations, I'm ashamed to say, which have been rubber stamping exercises. They haven't really been the expression of democracy or involvement that they are supposed to be. So yes, I don't want to delay or kind of make the planning system any more turgid than it is at the moment. But in getting this balance right, which I talked about earlier, I think there has to be room for more accountability, more local voices heard in these developments, and just more of a chance for us to have an impact, a direct impact on the way the city around us is changing. I don't think that's too much to ask, basically.
So to follow up on that, we then have a question from Claire Richards about how can we involve Londoners in the conversation? So what are the mechanisms you do it? Because I mean, people certainly they often get involved almost when it's too late, when there's something about to be put into that backyard. But we need to involve people in the wider debate, which is obviously why the London Society is here, and we'd like to get more members to do that. But what other solutions might you have?
Well, I suppose another one, I know I just criticised public consultation, but the principle of it is a good one. We should consult the public, and we should find a mechanism maybe to make the public feel that they're more involved or more engaged with the system. Now, I don't have all the answers. I'm not necessarily sure how we do that. Referendums are a potentially toxic term considering our recent history. I'm not saying that's the way necessarily to do it, but I think that particularly with big schemes, again, not to dwell on tall buildings, but have an impact beyond their immediate environs. There should be more of an effort made to make people aware who maybe don't even live in the borough, but who live in areas that might be affected in terms of views or light or streetscape or whatever, that these things are happening. And again, it comes down to the planning system. I mean, one of the problems is London's incredibly feudal. Boroughs are very introverted. I understand why, but they deal with their own patch. The GLA is supposed to provide the overall strategic kind of vision. I'm not sure how well they always do that, but maybe they're the ones to try and devise a mechanism by which more people, more Londoners can feel more involved in the way the city's changing and developing. But yeah, it's an easy answer. A mechanism needs to be developed. I'm not sure I've got the right one yet, but I agree with the principle.
Very good, thank you. Now, Daryl Chen asks, or says that it's a fantastic and timely book, but most of London is suburban, regular rows of terrace houses, and not necessarily a worthy character to preserve. Is it worth another book to think about outer London? Perhaps that's your next one.
Well, possibly. I know in the talk I talked very much about Central London. I do refer to outer London as well. I grew up, well, I'm sitting in Leighton now. I grew up in East London. There's a bits of non-Central London that I do refer to, but primarily, that's right, it is about Central London. But I'm not one of these people who's keen to introduce divisions between different segments of London. Yes, suburban London has a very different feel, but it also has town centres which have many similarities with elements or kind of characteristics or streetscapes you may find in central London. So there are thematic consistencies, which I would say, yes, suburban London's different to inner London, but there are themes that do combine the two. So I wouldn't be that keen on separating them. But yeah, maybe a book studying specifically suburban London might not be a bad idea.
Yeah, that'll keep you busy. Question from Sophie Hall Thompson. What role does monarchy have in the design of space, particularly in London, with reference to green spaces? That's an interesting one.
It is an interesting question, yeah. It's a very interesting question, and I suppose you could answer it in a number of ways. London has not been like Paris, where you've had a king or Baron Haussmann who's just flicked a switch, as it were, and kind of rebuilt the whole city. Charles II tried to do that, and the landlords told him no. They wanted to go back after the Great Fire of London to their old plot line. So London historically has been relatively free from that kind of authoritarian royal impact, if you like. But why that question is interesting is because one of the areas where it still has had an impact has been the Royal Parks. The Royal Parks are an incredible legacy, an incredible role bequeathed to London. That's a big part of this kind of natural characteristic I talked about. And we wouldn't probably have the Royal Parks, certainly in the manner in which we have them today, unless we had a monarchy. So the first Royal Park, I think, was St. James's Park. It was former royal hunting grounds, bequeathed to the nation by Charles II. So even though, yes, we don't have the kind of direct totalitarian instruction that monarchies or authoritarian regimes have had on the development of cities in the continent, there is still a very strong relationship, I would say, between the idea of monarchy and that idea of kind of collective ownership of kind of plush land within the city, and the idea of, I don't know, whatever you call it, democracy or liberty that we also have in London. And you find that the two, I think, are quite interlinked and quite close. So yeah, that's a great question, which I could wax lyrical about for hours, but I won't. So.
Yes, although I suppose the monarchy has never had much power in the city of London itself, so
No,
wouldn't have been able to stop all those towers happening.
No, I'm sure Prince Charles would love to, but he doesn't have the.
So now Michael Lowndes is asking, is local design policy sophisticated enough to maintain London's dynamic homogeneity? And perhaps along with that, one might add that the new London plan,
yes,
rather than having a more strategic view that you would like on tall buildings, is giving the power to local authorities to decide where tall buildings are built, if it ever gets through, that is.
It is, yes. That's as I understand, that's one of the changes that will happen. I'm not against that necessarily. I would still like that to happen within an overall framework that has a kind of overview of the city. But I'm not against localism, and I'm not against the idea of having these kind of very detailed, analytical local plans which are specifically conceived for the characteristics and kind of features and identity of local areas, and having them very specifically focused on their area. I know I did criticize the borough system earlier, but I think that is one of the advantages of the borough system, where you get this kind of forensic scrutiny of certain areas of London. So that's something I wouldn't necessarily like to get rid of. And I think this increased detail or quality of local plans in order to retain that lack of uniformity is a good thing. But what I think I'm saying is that I would also like to see maybe another layer over that, which just has a recognition or has an awareness of the strategic overview, so that decisions aren't being taken individually in silos, but there is a kind of awareness of the overall vision or plan for the city. So I think both can work together.
I think I'd agree with you, and probably the next questioner does as well, because certainly tall buildings do require, I think, strategic as well as local study. And so Jim here is asking, who is consulted before a very tall building is approved for construction in the City of London?
Right, well, initially it would go to the planning authority, who would be the City of London. The mayor has the ability to call it in afterwards, regardless of the decision the city's rendered. He can call it in, and he can give it that additional level of scrutiny as well. I think the GLA, the London plan, does have a threshold. Again, it may be another vague threshold for the size or scale of building, which is automatically referred to them. But the initial arbiters, if you like, is always a local authority, and then if it's big enough or significant enough, it goes to the GLA. And between that, you could also have buildings, and this has happened with a lot with, I think it happened with the Heron Tower and Shard as well, where they're caught a public inquiry, whereby central government steps in and the Secretary of State decides whether that should go ahead or not. So those three tiers, the first tier, local authority is always involved, but the other two tiers of central government and the GLA may get involved as and when they choose.
Great. Now, finally, I mean, this isn't a question, but I'm going to add a comment to it myself, and then you can respond before we call things to a halt. And so Janet Morris says, I've looked at the view across to Tower of London since 1989. I've watched that view change over decades, and it's clear that the City of London has decided what character it wants, i.e. clusters of high rises. We all now have to live with this, making the tower a sub-Disney World vision. I also like tall buildings and contemporary infrastructure, but it's too late now to protect the city. Now, you will probably agree with Janet's comment, but I'll make an alternative point. I mean, the thing about the Tower of London was that it was built by William the Conqueror. William the Conqueror arrived in London in 1067, after the Battle of Hastings, and normally any conquering king like that would have come and sacked the City of London probably, but the City of London was the place that delivered him lots of taxes. Yes, so he didn't want to play with it. but he built the Tower of London to keep an eye on the merchants in the City of London, so they didn't get out of hand, but he didn't want to interfere.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, it seems to me that actually this contrast, rather than context, the contrast between the tall buildings in the City of London illustrates this sort of difference in the balance of power from, King could control the city. Now, the Tower of London, it's just a tourist attraction, isn't it? Whereas it's the City of London which delivers the wealth for this nation. So doesn't the architecture actually reflect reality?
It does, in a way. It does reflect reality. And yes, the City of London has always delivered the wealth for not just the city, not just for London, but for the country. But the slight rejoinder to that, I would say, is that it's done that for around 1900 years without skyscrapers. So I'm not necessarily saying ban the skyscrapers, but it goes back to that word balance. I think there's a balance between retaining the icons, the monuments to manor, the monuments to wealth, that what the city is all about, but also retaining elements of the city's heritage. I mean, the questioner referred to it as a Disney Tower, which I understand why, because of the way it's been treated. It's the most visited castle in Europe. It is still an important part of London's heritage. I'm not kind of pitching it against the money side of it, as it were, but I think both can coexist. And I don't think one has to necessarily crush the other out of existence, which is what I think is sadly happening with the towers versus the tower, as it were, today. So there you go. For me, it's all about balance. But I do like your analogy. In many ways, the towers do represent the continuing domination of the merchants over the monarch. So that kind of conforms to London's history anyway.
Yeah, well, our cities do reflect our history always, and so I think that does it very well. And you've done very well tonight in, I think, giving us this idea of how we deliver a built environment which properly reflects London's character, its context, and how we should develop it in the future. So Ike, thank you very much indeed. That was most enjoyable, and afraid there's not a whole room full of applause, but I'll give my applause, and I'm sure everyone at home is doing the same thing. So thank you very much indeed, and thank you everybody for being here and listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Cheers.